Once again, it's my distinct pleasure not only to welcome you, but also to be welcomed at this, my first George Washington Carver Convocation. The role in the office of the President is to bring before us speakers who can help our campus community, enlighten our student community, to share words of wisdom that may be useful for us beyond the day in which we hear these words. When I arrived on this campus, on my very fourth day, I received a call from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, sight unseen. They offered me a gift of $30,000. And while that number obviously we're very appreciative of it, and although it's not a very large number in the scheme of things that is to come here at Tuskegee University, it still was a signal as to how much institutions, foundations, corporations, major donors were interested in our fine university. When a new president comes on board, he has to look within his staff, his faculty, his student body, and he has to say, what can be leveraged? With every gift, it must be properly stewarded, because even a gift of $30,000, a gift of $3,000, a gift of $300, and a gift of $3 ought to be stewarded in such a way that when we return to the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation to say, how was that gift that we gave directly to you, Dr. Johnson, stewarded, that I can return and suggest that it was stewarded properly. I bring that remark to you because I elected to put that gift into the archives. Many of you may or may not be aware, and Dana, you probably aren't aware of this as well, that in the office of the President, there is a letter written on April 28th, 1914, from Booker T. Washington. It's hanging in the office. In that letter, he acknowledges a gift of $5. Many of you, if you are a student of history, and I'm wondering if Dana is smiling behind me, April 28th, 1914, April 28th, 2014, precisely 100 years later, I was named president of Tuskegee University. And that interesting historical fact is important because on that day, April 28th, 2014, I immediately began my self-study of this university. I looked into its colleges, I looked at its faculty, I looked at its staff, I looked at its students, I received emails, and I started to hear and look and observe, and in one particular case, there was a shining light, and it was the archives in particular. And I read about him on the website, and I read about his work, and I learned about the collections, and I was doing all of this work prior to my arrival at June 13th. And so when I had an opportunity to bring these different lights, and trust me, he is not one of the only lights here. There are many of you who will be called upon, and in short order by this president, who have served in various capacities, where your light might have been dim and you might have been to the side. But in this administration, you will be brought to the forefront. So it is my deep pleasure, it is my deep honor to not introduce, but to, in many ways, affirm, reintroduce to some, one of the premier archivists in the nation. We have one of the premier archives in the world here at Tuskegee University. And as we proceed in this administration to not only strengthen and further our STEM programming, we want to also call attention to our arts, our humanities, and even our archives, which I hope Mr. Chandler will lend his expertise so that in addition to the programs that we intend to introduce in spring regarding fine and music arts, that we will also soon have an archivist degree program or certification. So it is my pleasure to introduce Mr. Dana Chandler.
I'm deeply humbled by the words that Dr. Johnson has just said. Thank you, Dr. Johnson. And thank you to all of you that have supported the archives over the years. I appreciate your kind words, and as we continue to work toward keeping Tuskegee before everybody's eyes. I want to begin my talk this morning by saying, I love this place. The first time I came here was in 1972. My father and mother brought me down here, and I was introduced to George Washington Carver's lab. And I immediately fell in love with Tuskegee. I consider you my family. And with that consideration, I also like to thank those that have been a part of my life and have helped us to grow, and certainly the Director of Library Services, Mrs. Roberts, and the library as a whole, my colleagues in the History Department and the College of Arts and Sciences. It continues to develop and to grow and to become an active and very vibrant place academically. But this morning we're going to be speaking about one of my favorite men, George Washington Carver. Beginning in the 1970s, revisionist historians have castigated Carver for what they claim his ascension to fame based on an exaggerated or fictional version of his accomplishments. Likewise, detractors and supporters have pointed to a lack of scientific formula and experimentation that could verify the claims of his brilliance and methods. I do want to make some clarifications, though, if you'll permit me. George Washington Carver did not invent peanut butter. It was actually invented by the Inca peoples. He only made it smooth. I think that's a big deal, too. The Tuskegee University Archives has given us an opportunity to look through the window of time in the life of a man that is still enigmatic, a man that still brings to mind so many accomplishments. But it's interpreting history that's so important for us this morning. Who was he? What did he accomplish? Did he accomplish anything? Historical revisionism is the re-examination of the accepted facts and interpretations of history with an eye toward updating and re-examining with a more accurate and hopefully less biased information. Broadly, it is a skeptical approach. And this skeptical approach is to re-examine what has been traditionally told that may not be entirely accurate, and that perhaps an accurate history is unobtainable as a dispassionate autobiography. But while reinterpreting past events in light of new facts is the evidence of good scholarship, corrupt history may distort these facts as a means of influencing readers' beliefs and actions for politically or socially motivated reasons. Revisionist history sometimes is also used to promote or slander persons, or promote or discredit an idea. This usually backfires as often as it succeeds. The key is recognizing historical bias and interpreting the information through the bias. Current researchers on Carver, such as Mark Hersey and Gary Kramer, have done a great job when enlightening us further about Carver and his work. But there are still questions that have to be answered. For some questions, we will never have an answer. The problem is that some bias is replicated over and over again, and we have to answer that bias. So I'm going to look at several biographers of Carver. I want to see what they had to say about him. Biographer Linda McMurray wrote, "The romance of his life story and the eccentricities of his personality led to his metamorphosis into kind of a folk saint, both in his lifetime and after." She said, "Separating the real George Washington Carver from the symbolic portrayals of his life is difficult. Reality and mythology became blurred even within Carver's own mind, and his life did have mythic qualities. How do we respond to that? With the truth. Barry McIntosh, a historian with the National Park Service, writing in a document called George Washington Carver, The Making of a Myth. George Washington Carver became a legend in his own lifetime with a popular reputation for far transcending the significance of his accomplishments. Does that make you mad? Makes me mad. His agricultural education and extension work at Tuskegee Institute was praiseworthy but unspectacular in nature and impact. The uses for soils and plants he developed or advocated were not of pioneering importance in science. His legendary reputation depended less on these supposed achievements than on his psychological and social utility to both blacks and whites. Elmer Kyle, writing in a document, The Scientific Contributions of George Washington Carver, Dr. Carver appears now to have been an intelligent and gifted individual with great perseverance and varied interest in even scientific fields. Due to the circumstances under which he first went to Tuskegee Institute, he was unable to follow any one interest to completion. He did not make any great scientific discoveries, nor did he further scientific knowledge to any great extent. He did say, based on available information, Dr. Carver's products were not the result of new ideas or procedures. Wow. These are the respected biographers of Carver. Biographer Rackham Holt, the only major Carver biography with a claim toward objectivity. Rackham Holt's George Washington Carver appeared the year of his death. Holt recognized Carver's products as not revolutionary in themselves and saw his major contribution as that of a publicist. Yet the romantic tone of her book did little to counter his established image. I don't even know how she could write that. The woman did not work with him on a face-to-face basis. She actually worked with Carver's assistant. Blogger Chris Pearson, and this is what's being said today, right now. George Washington Carver was not a saint whose soulful nobility enabled him to overcome insurmountable obstacles in order to fulfill his altruistic mission of saving the agrarian South. Instead, he was a smart, determined man who had no objection to exaggerating and aggrandizing his real success to enjoy the perks and honors of fame. The mystery then becomes how and why the apotheosis of Carver from exceptional human being to the personification of human science took place, and perhaps more perplexingly, why that immaculate image of George Washington Carver persists to this day despite easily accessed, well-documented evidence to the contrary. I want to ask that man, when did you come to the archives? When did you see that evidence to the contrary? He's never been. Like many people, these are tough claims and bold statements. So who was Carver? Who was Carver? A legend in his own mind, as these other biographers have said? Listen to what history has to tell. As for Carver's humility and intentions, he did not want to wear the title of doctor. Carver had 3 honorary degrees from Simpson College in 1928, Rochester College in 1941, and Selma University in 1942. Yet in a letter to his mentor, Dr. Pamel, he said, I don't like it when they call me doctor. I don't have a doctorate. That's humility, isn't it? That's humility. Some compile the biographies of Carver and reach other conclusions. Granted, there were some that went too far the other way. Let's look at some of those. In 1946, popular biographer Herman Hagedorn held Carver single-handedly responsible for the tariff on peanuts as a result of his showmanship before the Congressional Committee, and largely responsible for freeing the South from dependence on cotton. 2 other serious works treating Carver appeared during the post-war period. In Titans of the Soul, issued in 1949 by the University of North Carolina Press, Edward Jerome Dias attributed to Carver's discoveries the establishment of major business enterprises. And even though Carver's laboratory records were unknown, Langston Hughes wrote with an unintentional irony in famous American Negroes, from Carver's small laboratory at Tuskegee came formulas in agricultural chemistry that enriched the entire Southland, indeed the whole of America and the world. The last and probably the most extensive mass circulation of the Carver myth came with the condensation of Lawrence Elliott's George Washington Carver, The Man Who Overcame, in the May 1965 Reader's Digest. Elliott's book had Carver in conjunction with the boll weevil, responsible for making peanuts the principal crop much of the South prior to the First World War, then for developing well over 300 peanut products manufactured in scores of factories. The South's economic salvation was due to Carver alone. So we go from one extreme to the other, don't we? If history is a continuing dialogue between the past and present, then we must take into consideration both sides of the story. The problem is, there's not been the other side, because most people have not seen what we have in the archives. Since Carver, here's the arguments, and this is defined by Chris Pearson, and it really is a summation of what the other biographers were saying. Since Carver left no formulas or other records of his processes beyond one patent, well, that's not completely true, for a cosmetic utilizing peanuts, it was impossible for later investigators to evaluate most of the peanut products attributed to him or to document his production of them. Because the great majority of products on Carver's list could be made more easily and cheaply from other substances, they were of little more than curiosity value. In academia, many adhere to this notion. In fact, in a document called George Washington Carver, Hero Hype, One Heck of a Guy, three patents he had, one for cosmetics and two for paints and stains, were issued to George Washington Carver in the years 1925 to 1927. See, even then, he's got it completely wrong. Completely wrong. Like the other products, these were never, however, commercially successful. Aside from these patents and some recipes for food, he had left no formulas or procedures for making his products. He did not keep a laboratory notebook. How do you know, if you've never been here, to do the research? So frustrating. So with all the information above, we have this assessment of Carver. Since his personal attributes alone were insufficient to support his claims of greatness, his laboratory work was revised and extended to a level of wizardry to be joined by his exploits in saving the Southern economy. Of course, that was all facetiously said. So let's interpret the information. First of all, just because no information regarding his experiments was found at the time these people were writing, it does not mean that it did not exist. Sometimes, information is given based on the question asked. This can mean that some things are emphasized while others are not. Just because one piece of information seems to contradict another, it does not mean that they are mutually exclusive. Let me give you an example. The University Archives has 4 different autobiographies, including one oral history interview that was transcribed by W.A. Liston and Etta M. Rudd. One mentions only Carver and his brother Jim. One mentions that he had a brother Jim and 2 sisters, twins, that died. One mentions that he had a brother Jim and another sister named Melissa that was carried off with him and his mother. Which version is correct? Can we discount one for the other? I think that all are correct, and it just depends on his memory of the time and the questions that were asked of him. According to many, a big part of the problem was a lack of definitive evidence regarding Carver. Sometimes we need to extrapolate, and that's what they did. Now, Carver's 3 patents had to meet, listen, Carver's 3 patents had to meet certain requirements. The U.S. Patents Office general requirements for a utility patent state: whoever invents or discovers any new and useful process, machine, manufacture, or composition of matter, or any new and useful improvements thereof may obtain a patent subject to the conditions and requirements of this title. In other words, for an invention to be patentable, it must, number 1, be statutory, number 2, be new, number 3, be useful, number 4, non-obvious. Notice that third number there? Useful. That's important, isn't it? According to many, a big part of the problem was, again, lack of definitive evidence, and sometimes the evidence needs to be found. During Elmer Kyle's, listen, this happened just only a short while ago in the scheme of things. Well, from my life standpoint, it's a short time ago. During Elmer Kyle's visit to Tuskegee in 1961, he and his companions sought out information about Carver's experiments. They were instructed by the National Park Service Midwest Division to do a research on Carver to determine how good a scientist he really was. They contacted individuals B.D. Mayberry, James Henderson, Clarence Mason, and Jesse Guzman. Now, if you knew them like I know them, that's an amazing group of people right there. All basically said that they had very little information that they could give him. What they did not know, and that we now know, Elaine Thomas, then director of the Carver Museum, was not available to be interviewed. Therefore, they could not see the materials that she had. You see, what they had were a few of his bulletins, some newspaper articles, a few letters, but nothing more. That's why they made the claim that Carver had nothing, absolutely nothing substantive to say. No proof of his experiments. What did Elaine Thomas have? She had information that dispels claims that he was not a good scientist. We found 7 notebooks. One notebook was found that was damaged by fire and was found in a building that was being renovated, and they were going to throw away all the materials. And we were able to go there before it was thrown away and retrieve these materials. What did they contain? Carver's experiments, Carver's drawings, Carver's observations. Here they are. What do they have in them? Well, look, the drawings up here, the beautiful drawings. What is that? That's a tomato, isn't it? And beside that, same facing page, is his formula regarding the development of the tomato and regarding the development of an insecticide. The other side shows you some of his formulas and other discoveries. These notebooks are full of information, yet they were not shown to these individuals. The notebooks are filled with his experiments, revealing his, now listen to this, environmental sensitivity. He spent many hours working with the amaryllis trying to better the varieties. I'm convinced, as are many others, that some of his hybrids are still popular today. That's going to require some of you biologists that do your thing. We archivists don't do, but we'll help you out whenever we can. Many pages are dedicated to water purity and usage. There was a problem on campus in the 1930s, and the problem was dysentery. And it was raging rampant throughout the campus and throughout the community. George Washington Carver tested every well and determined that it was water from a specific well where there had been trash and dead animals that had fallen down into it. He cleaned out the well, got rid of the dysentery. He sought how to reuse plant matter in a variety of ways beyond cooking, such as paint and better feed. Some experiments aided him in preparing his bulletins. The 7th notebook that we found in the building that was to be renovated, shown here, it has amazing, amazing experiments in there. Some of them is dealing with milk and how to make milk better, to make it last longer. Remember, we're talking about a time when most people didn't have ice, right? Or have access to ice. So he's trying to help them to develop a method to use milk. He came up with a way to powder milk. So why have these notebooks remained hidden? Carver said this, and Jesse Guzman wrote this quote from George Washington Carver. One reason I never patent my products is that if I did, it would take so much time, I would get nothing else done. But mainly, I don't want my discoveries to benefit specific favored persons. That speaks volumes, doesn't it? In that environment of the time, this is what caught our eye. This is what really got us thinking about Carver. Carver as an environmentalist. Carver as the first African-American green scientist. And he was. In bulletin number 35, published in 1925, entitled How to Grow the Cowpea and 40 Ways of Preparing It as a Table Delicacy, Carver made an interesting statement. By the way, y'all remember cowpeas? I remember them growing up as a kid here in the South. We had them all the time. Notice what he says. Thus far, the demand has been far greater than the supply, hence prices have always been good. For green manuring, it is universally grown and admired. When the running varieties are planted with corn, sorghum, etc., it makes a very superior silage, greatly relished by all kinds of stock. He begins the article by stating that the cowpea stands out prominently. Agreed, the phrase green manuring no doubt means the cowpea could be used as a cover crop grown to replenish the soil with useful nutrients. But in this bulletin, he lists 11 reasons for growing the cowpea that go beyond its primary use as a food source or ground cover. He was looking for a way to use the cowpea to help man, beast, and the earth in a natural and safe way. So Carver developed what's called as a use and reuse method. In bulletin number 41, published in 1936, entitled, Can Livestock Be Raised Profitably in Alabama? Carver wrote this, It is easy to see that our farm animals are great fertilizer factories, turning out the cheapest and best known product for the permanent building up of the soil. In addition to this farmyard manure, there are also many thousands of tons of the finest fertilizers going to waste all over the South in the form of decaying leaves of the forest and the rich sediments of the swamp known as muck. Every idle moment should be put in gathering up these fertilizers. What's interesting to me is he starts out with the cowpea as an essential food source for livestock whose manure fertilizes the same. That's amazing. Carver's participation in reusing, recycling, and utilizing earth-friendly measures was more than helping people to succeed economically. It was part of his worldview. He was concerned with what we did with God's creation. He says, I believe the great Creator has put oil and ores on this earth to give us a breathing spell. And now listen, this sounds like something right today. Somebody making a speech today. He says, as we exhaust them, we must be prepared to fall back on our farms, for we can learn to synthesize materials for every human need from the things that we grow. Because of his awareness of the finite quantity of natural resources, he sought to reuse those materials to continue to aid mankind. Let me show you something. Crop rotation has become an important phrase in the green movement, especially regarding organic farming. Forage and grain legumes, especially clover, must be used in organic crop rotations as a soil fertility increasing component. Carver was well aware of this at least a century ago. Carver worked to develop paints and stains from natural products. His experimentation went beyond investigation to recycling. This is amazing. The United States government in 1941 sends out a grant proposal, an RFP, for somebody to provide paint to paint all of the vehicles. That's terrestrial and sea vessels for the military, to provide paint. Carver produced a method for utilizing bulk, listen to this, used motor oil as a base for commercial paint. I've not seen that anywhere else. specifically government and military vehicles used during World War II. Now, his peers felt the formula are missing, so we have no clue to his proposition regarding lack of evidence of formulas is what they were doing. They were saying, "Oh, we don't know what Carver did. Look, here we see Carver's testing methods for a variety of paints for different materials." Is that not what a scientist does? Is it? Here is an outline prepared by Carver and typed up by his assistant, Curtis, for a formula for clay or iron oxide-based paints. Interestingly, Carver's stains were used locally, such as the former White Episcopal Church here in Tuskegee, and at the Richmond Hill plantation owned by Henry Ford in Richmond Hill, Georgia. It was used as a stain on some Rosenwald school floors. And last week, shock upon shock, the pews that were in the White Episcopal Church, some of them ended up at a church in North Alabama. And the lady contacted me this past week. She wants me to come up there and look at the pews. She says somebody told her that they were stained with Carver stains. Carver wanted young people to be informed about nature. He wrote a textbook, a 223-page manuscript to be used in common schools, high schools, and academies. The title, Botany Made Easy, never has been published. We have the complete document with his sketches that go along with that document. Never was published. Covered many plants seen throughout the South and throughout the nation. Isn't that what scientists do? Is that? Sure it is. Webster's dictionary defines a scientist as a person learned in science and especially natural science, a scientific investigator. So my question to you this morning or this afternoon, does the preceding information indicate that Carver was a scientist? Of course it does. Something peculiar to Carver. He saw himself as a trailblazer, leaving the details of many of his discoveries to others. And it requires research. One of the things that we have just come across in the archives in recent times, my assistant Cheryl Ferguson went on a discovery mission to a house here in town, and in the attic they found Jesse Guzman's notes on a biography of George Washington Carver. Those notes, oh my, what they tell us now is so amazing. So our understanding of Carver, who he was, and what he was intending to do, increases with each and every passing month. In 1916, George Washington Carver was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society for the Encouragement of Arts, Manufactures, Commerce in London, England. I contacted them. I wanted to know, what does it take to become a member of that illustrious society? The society's core members are the fellows. Fellows are eligible to use the postnominals FRSA, which Carver never did. Fellows are elected to membership of the fellowship and must have demonstrated achievement or potential related to the arts, manufactures, and commerce. Now, this happened in 1916, when very few people knew about Carver on a worldwide basis. And yet they're giving him an award from that prestigious society. This was the first of many honors that Carver would get. Would the RSA have chosen someone who could not meet their standards? No. Finally, many claims have been made concerning Carver's achievements. But have the many people that used his bulletins been consulted regarding whether their situation was better after reading them? How many did he influence with his teaching? Just recently, we had a gentleman who came to the archives. He's doing research on Carver for a book about his father. His father was one of Carver's boys. Young men that were writing Carver for advice on things in the world and things in the hereafter. When talking to him, we told him that we had the letters that his father had sent to Carver. But we did not have the letters that Carver sent to his father. Oh my, he had them all, 28. We have subsequently added those to our archives, and they have substantially increased our knowledge of Carver as a man, as a humanitarian, and as a man of God. The dialogue continues. The current evidence shows that Carver was a remarkable scientist. He had a keen intellect trying to understand the mysteries of God's creation and how those mysteries could help his fellow man. That's Carver's legacy to all of us. And it's a legacy that continues on here at Tuskegee with the work that Dr. Johnson has entrusted to all of us. And as we work toward enlightening the world about Tuskegee, its accomplishments, I had a group come through this morning, a tour group from Tougaloo, Mississippi. And I started naming off all the firsts here at Tuskegee. I told him, the professor that was leading the group, I said, look, it would take us a couple more hours to name off all the firsts that occurred here at Tuskegee. The legacy is rich, and it will get richer when we continue to have the vision of men such as Dr. Johnson and the faculty and the staff that we have here today. Thank you.
See, and that's why I love Tuskegee. Honestly, I don't care. Some people have jobs. I believe the greatest 3 7-letter words in succession are purpose, passion, and calling. And what you have heard on today was a man, a person who was skilled in his field, his discipline, who I'm sure we're not paying well enough, but is sharing with this community, with this president, knowledge that I assure you, Dana, we are going to capitalize on. Put that in the records. Put it in the records. As a matter of fact, I wish to say to you, so inspired by that, the French philosopher and historian John Lecoq says, I have seen the future, and it was the past. We here at Tuskegee have a greater claim to the future than any institution in this nation. Its legacy is deep. Its legacy is rich. However, as Dana has reminded us, that so much error, so much misinformation occurs because of the worst 9-letter word in the world. What is it? Ignorance. But on this day, our colleague has shared with us the second greatest 9-letter word, which is knowledge. And I wish to say to all of you, my students, my faculty, we need not continuously go to others for help. We are our own help. We need to reach down inside of this institution's great legacy, inside of its archives. Yes, you may not be getting paid enough for the 8 or 4 hours or 40 hours you are being paid for. Work harder. Go into the archives, dig and go deeper, and pull out a treasure that this university can leverage to the world. Dana's doing it. I'm doing it. You can do it. If each and every one of you do what Dana is doing, this university is going to move steadfastly into the 21st century at lightning breakneck speed. So I applaud my colleague again because This is the kind of Tuskegee University faculty member, staff member, student that we wish to have at this university. Tuskegee University, very best and brightest. At this time, we are going to sing our beloved Tuskegee song led by Dr. Barr and the Tuskegee University Choir of the Golden Voices.